Welcome back. I'm Alfred Lamoureux Weber, and today we have the extraordinary privilege, once again, of being with independent scientist Leuren Moret, who's coming to us from Berkeley, California, this time to do part two, a highly anticipated part two of her series on the origins, exposing the origins and operations of the secret Babylonian cult, now known as the Jesuits. Welcome, Leuren.
Thank you.
Well, we've received quite a lot of positive input since the airing of part one of the interview. And of course, we left off part one. It went to the middle of the 19th century, just entering into the 20th century. And perhaps it would be good to give kind of an overview now, just to again remind people. And you had talked, as we were about to go on camera, about the Jesuit oath, which is actually in the congressional record. Is this the Jesuit oath? It must be the public oath and not the super secret oath.
This is the super secret oath from 1843, and it is in the congressional record.
Oh, Lord. Okay.
And this is an oath taken by higher level Jesuits, but it's very, very similar to the regular oath. But they are all secret.
Right. And could you tell us more about it?
About the oath?
Yeah.
Well, the oath is taken by the Jesuit who is becoming a Jesuit, and there are two officials with him. One administers the oath and one stands beside him. And this oath is spoken, or the subject takes the oath, the Jesuit acolyte takes the oath with a little dagger in his hand pointed at his heart. And this is, I'm just going to read a part of the diabolical oath. When a Jesuit of the minor rank is to be elevated to command, he is conducted into the chapel of the convent of the order, where there are only three others present. The principal or superior standing in front of the altar. On either side stands a monk, one of whom holds a banner of yellow and white, which are the papal colors, and the other a black banner with a dagger and red cross above a skull and crossbones, with the word INRI, and below them the words Iustum Necar Regis Impius. That's Latin. And that meaning is, quote, it is just to exterminate or annihilate impious or heretical kings, governments, or rulers. And that's just one of the important parts of the oath. This is the other part. Quote, I furthermore promise and declare that I will, when opportunity present, make and wage relentless war, secretly or openly, against all heretics, Protestants, and liberals, as I am directed to do, to extirpate and exterminate them from the face of this whole earth, and that I will spare neither age, sex, or condition, and that I will hang, waste, boil, flay, strangle, and bury alive these infamous heretics, rip up the stomachs and wombs of their women, and crush their infants' heads against the walls, in order to annihilate forever their execrable race. That when the same cannot be done openly, I will secretly use the poisoned cup, the strangulating cord, the steel of the poniard, or the leaden bullet, regardless of the honor, rank, dignity, or authority of the person or persons, whatever may be their condition in life, either public or private, as I at any time may be directed so to do by any agent of the Pope or superior of the Brotherhood of the Holy Faith of the Society of Jesus. Pretty horrific oath.
Right, and that brings to mind how the Jesuits have morphed from a Babylonian cult, then to the Knights Templar, and then morphed their corporate identity into the Jesuits. So they really have maintained a consistent identity over more than 3,000 years.
No, they were formed in about the 1520s.
No. I meant
yes.
not the Jesuit. I mean the underlying cult.
Yes, the tradition. Yes.
Yeah,
and belief system. It's a cultic beliefs, and very militarized. It's a military organization. It was set up by a soldier, Ignacio Loyola. He was from a family of knights. He was a Sephardic Jew in Navarre, which is a part of Spain. There are a lot of Basques there. And he was a professional soldier, but he was injured in a battle and could no longer serve as a professional soldier. So he went back to the family castle, and he laid around for a while and recovered. And then he had a vision or something, and decided to pursue a quasi-religious life. And he ended up in Paris and other places. And he met Francis Borgia somehow, who was the Duke of a Spanish Duke, and of course one of the very, very dark families like the Medicis. And Francis Borgia funded the formation of the Jesuit organization, which we know now was just rebranding or renaming a tradition that had gone on for thousands of years. And what we're seeing today in the situation in the Ukraine is the New World Order, which would be the Borgias and the Medicis and whoever else is part of that, trying to transform the societies and the culture that countries, people around the world have pursued. It's their heritage for thousands of years. They're erasing all of that in order to create a global merchant style corporation in the style of the Dutch East India Company, the East India Company, and other basically corporations from the starting in the 1500s, colonizing the world. And it's all about genocide, exploitation, and looting mineral resources and treasures from weaker people.
Right. Now, you have gone in and taught and looked at Sakai in the 1500s, Berkeley's sister city. You live in Berkeley, California. Could you talk about some of the connections there?
Yes, I was I was looking for images, period images, that showed how for instance, the logos, the ships with the Templar cross on the sails, things like that. Uh, Beginning with Magellan and Vasco da Gama, who were Portuguese explorers, and they really opened up Asia and much of the world. Magellan was the first sailor or person to circumnavigate the world, and that was in the 1400s. And of course, he had a big Knights Templar Red Cross on his sails, and he was followed by Vasco da Gama, who at the end of the 1400s and very early 1500s, he led expeditions south around the Horn of Africa and up into the Indian Ocean, and set up Jesuit colonies in India. And you wouldn't believe it, but they were caught. The Jesuits had a presence, missionary establishments in Vietnam and other Southeast Asian countries, and then others went to the Philippines, Japan, China, and in this very, very early lacquerware with images of the Portuguese arriving, the very first Portuguese Jesuit his last name was Xavier, and I believe it was Francis Xavier. And there are lacquer images of him from the 1500s when he arrived, and then later images of later Portuguese ships arriving in the harbor of Nagasaki. And in these images and ancient maps from the 1500s, I found a map of Sakai. And Sakai at that time was a thriving city on the interior sea of Japan, and it's a suburb now of Odessa, which is a large city now. But at that time, there was only a Sakai. And what I learned during 20 speaking tours of Japan, warning them about the danger of nuclear power and the very extremely large magnitude and very frequent earthquakes that happen in Japan, and how dangerous that was with 55 nuclear power plants all on the ocean, situated on the ocean. I visited Odessa and Sakai and learned that Osaka, I learned that Osaka, the University of Osaka, and that area is the headquarters of the Rothschilds in Japan since the 1700s, and that it's also the University of Osaka is where the secret nuclear weapons program is that Japan has had since even before World War One. World War Two. And I said, oh, I was so excited when I found that map of Sakai from the 1500s, because Sakai is the sister city of Berkeley in Japan. and it's the only normal sister city that Berkeley has. They have adopted sister cities in countries around the world that oppose, that are victimized by U.S. foreign policy and sanctions. Sakai is the only normal, uncontroversial sister city that we have. And now I understand why the Rothschilds are there, why the nuclear weapons program is there. It's because the Jesuits were aware of and probably lived and colonized Sakai as well as Nagasaki until the shogun prohibited Christianity and Jesuits in Japan.
Mm-hmm. Hmm. Now, how does this tie in, bringing it up to the modern date with the University of California at Berkeley and its surveillance network?
Well, in the 20 speaking tours that I did around Japan, I realized that I was under surveillance the whole time. And I also realized that many of the people who invited me to speak or set up speaking events or hosted me or whatever, because some of them were very strange experiences, that the University of California used a Jesuit network in Japan to handle me the whole time I was there. And then I went to Malaysia. You and I were there for the war crimes tribunals organized by Tun Dr. Mahathir, the former Prime Minister of Malaysia. And I went on to visit Ceylon, which is Sri Lanka now. Then I went to Burma, which is now Myanmar. And I also went to Thailand. And there were handlers everywhere I went. And they had mostly worked in Japan. So they were part of the U.S. network in Japan. And UC Berkeley simply keeps a permanent record and tracks all students and alumni for the rest of their lives. So once you go to the University of California, you enter it, you're under surveillance for the rest of your life. It's probably true of other universities in the United States as well. And the reason they do that is they want to use you. They want to steal your intellectual property. They want to chess move you around into different jobs and career opportunities without you even knowing. And they also do matchmaking, in other words, strategic marriages. They want to marry women off to wealthy men so that they can get alumni donations. Larry Ellison is going to probably make a large donation to the University of California because he had an extreme sporting accident on a bicycle and broke his elbow. And the University of California at Davis did the surgery through their special sports injury program. And he just dropped $5 million in their gift basket after the surgery. He was so happy to be able to use his elbow again. And they will be cultivating him and doing favors for him. They did modify the weather for him during the America's Cup race in September of 2013. And New Zealand had nearly beat Larry Ellison, and at the last minute all this HARP weather came in, and it was used and manipulated in a way that gave Larry Ellison time to make adjustments to his sailing yacht in order that they could win and beat New Zealand. It was an unbelievable race. It was obviously another crooked sports event. But that's how they use their contacts and alumni and wealthy people who become involved with them. So I realized that this is a different world now. There's communication is so fast now and centralized that institutions are able to know everything about a person's life without them even knowing it.
Right. And of course, Larry Ellison is the founder of Oracle.
Oracle, yes.
Yeah, correct. Now, just to go into provide an overview of the Jesuits, maybe going back to the Crusades, to the merchant trade, to the Ukraine, and to what Putin represents. Do you want to go through that?
Yes.
Kind of feel.
Yes. I started studying the Jesuits, investigating them, because I had realized the Rothschilds and the international financiers like the Rockefellers, J.P. Morgan, Chase, and so forth, that they worked for someone above them. And it's taken me 14 years to dig all of this information out, because I was a scientist and working in laboratories and traveling around the world doing field work. But I love many, many topics, and because I'm a geoscientist, we use many different tools, many more in academia than other disciplines are able to do. So we use physics, chemistry, statistics, sociology, politics. You've heard the word geopolitics or geopolitical issues. There's nothing that the earth sciences don't use to understand the history of the earth. And geography is the history of the relationship of man to the land surface, to the earth. So they're all, I don't think you can really separate disciplines. I think they're all integrated and they're all related, and it's better to look at take a macro approach and then use these individual disciplines as tools to broaden your understanding of whatever issue you're working on. So for me, it's an adventure every day, and I love it. It's exciting. I get to use all the experiences and education that I've paid for myself through my life, and then I've met wonderful people. So I've really had a lot of fun learning all of this, and my purpose and your purpose for doing these interviews and writing the articles and presenting this information and continuing to do the research and updating it is to educate the public, because the world turns on information. And I think people around the world know now that the global media is owned by very special interests, controlled by very special interests, and they are not interested in forming and empowering the public, helping them to organize themselves in democratic movements of self-determination. They're really interested in promoting the divine right to rule, monarchies, corrupt churches, things like that. So, I am happy about the comments that people have made, the interest they have in these interviews, and Fukushima and the Jesuits have been, and the two airplane crashes, MH370 and MH17, they have brought the most interest to our websites and to our YouTube channels. So I'm happy to be here today doing this second interview on the Jesuits with you, Alfred, because you're so knowledgeable yourself. And people really like your style of doing interviews. So welcome everyone to our second Jesuit interview. And
Yeah, I should say here, could I?
yes,
Kind of a truth in broadcasting note, and that is that one of my uncles, one of the brothers of my mother, who was born in Havana, Cuba, was a certain Richard Chisholm, who was a Jesuit. And I've written an article about this on my website, exopolitics.com. He was a Jesuit who became the right-hand person to Pedro Arrupe, who was the Black Pope, or a Black Pope, or the head of the Jesuits during the regime of Pope Paul VI, Pope John Paul the 23rd, Pope Paul the VI, and Pope John Paul II. And he was the right-hand man to Pedro Arrupe, who was the only Black Pope to have been kicked out. He was so bad. So that I feel that I incarnated into that family and had that family member, so that from birth I would have seen the inside of the Jesuits. And although I was alienated from my Uncle Richard when I went to university and disavowed Catholicism, I understood all of the significance of this research on the Jesuits when it first came to public life, to public light. So anyway, I just wanted to add that.
well, that's actually very important. I've worked in 2 nuclear weapons labs, even though I'm a pacifist and from a Huguenot French Protestant background. And just because you're of them doesn't mean that you're with them. And we have very valuable insights to share with people now, because we were in those houses working for those people, and we saw many things and observed many things and met many different kinds of people and made contacts and so forth. We're familiar with their house and their culture, and that makes us much better reporters, journalists, or experts, specialists on these topics, because we've been there. We've walked in their halls. We've worked in their laboratories. We've seen them. We know how they think. We know what the structure of their organization is. And that's very necessary. It's very different from reading someone else's information and interpretation about an issue or an experience.
Exactly. So I just wanted to state that that so that people understood where we're coming from.
Yes, and we're born into things, into families, into traditions, into religions, into expectations, and we have no control over that. It's the choice making you make during your lifetime, choosing who you are, choosing what you want to be, choosing what you want to do, and leaving behind what you were born into. It doesn't mean you're part of that. You're of that, but it doesn't mean that you buy into that. And it's making choices that makes you a human being. It's surviving experiences that that are maybe horrifying or difficult or whatever, that makes you who you are, even making mistakes. I don't think there's such a thing as making a mistake. It's a growing experience. So, people who are interested.
Sorry, there. You, your sound has started to break up.
Oh, can you hear me now?
Yes, I can.
Okay. So, I want to encourage people to go and do their own research. You and I didn't know all this stuff. We went and did our own research. Hours and hours in libraries, or we have the internet now. You can get lots of information on the internet. So what we're telling you is it's on the front page. It's there for everyone to read. You just need to know what the right question is to ask in order to get the answers that you're looking for. So don't be afraid. Do your own research and share it with people, and you'll feel empowered. You'll feel like you're doing something instead of looking at this disaster that we're living in. And it's happened over and over and over again throughout the history of humanity on this planet.
Right. Now, I interrupted your train,
Yes.
and I apologize. So, where exactly do you want to pick up the
Okay, let's start.
overview?
What we'll do is start. I know I got off track. We'll start with the Crusades, because beginning to investigate the Jesuits, who were only founded in the 1500s, took me back to the Crusades. And they were organized in Europe, Northern Europe, probably in the area of Belgium, Flanders, France, the Netherlands. And they were actually, the motive was to capture the Silk Road that had operated for at least 5,000 years across Asia, and revive it. It was in decline and ended in the Middle East. And these Crusaders, knights, wanted to go and recapture and revive the Silk Road, and then divert the funds, the money flow, the wealth, into Europe, into their coffers, kind of hijacking the Silk Road into Europe. And what I learned is that the Crusaders had guilds, like the Knights Templars, the Knights Hospitallers, different groups, and they sort of formed to guide the pilgrims to the Holy Land, to protect them, but also to engage in wars in the Middle East with Saladin, for instance, with the leaders of the Ottoman Empire, which was huge. The Ottoman Empire was vast. It was much bigger than the Roman Empire. And then I learned that Freemasonry started with the Crusades and with the Crusaders. They also were military, the Crusaders, and they were the shock troops. In any battle, they would be the ones who, on these huge horses and everything with lances, they would break through the lines, the front lines of the enemy army, and allow their own footmen or foot soldiers to engage in warfare. And then I learned that in order to travel from Europe to the Middle East, to Jerusalem, basically, they had to devise a way to transport wealth because of the robbers and the assassins and the murderers along the way who wanted to steal any valuable property that they had with them or anything of value. And so what they did was the Crusaders would deposit whatever money they had planned to take with them to Jerusalem, and they would deposit it with the Templars wherever they were. And if it was property, it would be taken care of. You know, if it was a farm or there were animals to feed or things like that, or other kinds of property, the Templars would take care of it in Europe, and they would give the traveling person, and this would be pilgrims as well as the knights, a letter of credit, basically, they would carry with them on their person. And when they arrived in Jerusalem, they would go to the Temple on the Mount, which was the headquarters for the Crusaders, for the Templars, and they would give it to the bank. It was basically a bank, acting like a bank, and they would have credit for anything they needed to buy while they were in that area. They also built castles. They took over islands in the Mediterranean, the island of Cyprus, which is offshore from Turkey. The whole island was their headquarters for a while. And I've been there and seen the ancient ports and the landing places where they tied their ships up. I mean, people are still using the infrastructure that they left. It's amazing when you see something and know it's that old, and what a history it has. And so banking, Freemasonry, also pedophilia and perversion crept into the culture of the Templars later in the declining years. They were operative from just about 1100, a little before that, for about 200 years, and then the Crusades kind of slowed down and sort of shriveled up. But they left quite a legacy, and if you look at flags, Queen Elizabeth's crowns, the popes, you see the Knights Templar Red Cross all over the place. And as Confucius said thousands of years ago, signs and symbols rule the world, not words and laws. And signs and symbols are extremely powerful. It's something for us to become educated about, because it gives us much more information about what's happening and who's involved, and where the network is, and how the power flows and the control, and we're part of it. So we should know about it, although most of us are not operatives in that network. We're kind of victims of it. So the Knights Templars and the Crusades led to a whole new infrastructure in Europe. They took Moorish people or people from the Middle East, especially Palestinians, back to Europe. They were the most educated people in North Africa and Europe. And they were engineers, medical doctors, astronomers, all kinds of things. And they made the Knights Templars very, very rich. They were so rich, they put kings on thrones and kept them there. They had their own armies and navies that were larger than anything any monarch had. And they were very, very well organized. They weren't just warriors. They were businessmen. They were merchants. And as the large infrastructure and organization sort of went into decline, it just transformed into local businesses, local power flow and structures. And it's still there, very much so. When you look at the Queen's crown, when you look at some of the flags in NATO headquarters, when you look at the red crosses, Templar crosses on the popes, you begin to realize that all we're doing in changing names is rebranding traditions and mechanisms and infrastructure that have been there for thousands of years.
Right, right. So this begins to get us now uh, uh, into moving us into the last century,
Yes,
and we had talked about how the Jesuits uh, began to destabilize and focus on the U.S.
yes,
Through the Civil War,
yes.
and perhaps now, uh, 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 would you like to look at one major? Uh, there's sort of a case history that 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 we could go into, and that is the case history of the Ukraine, and then perhaps come back and go through the history of the Jesuits and their focus on the U.S. and then kind of the modern infrastructure. Does that make sense at all?
Well, what I'm going to do is kind of weave in the what's happening in the U.S.
Yeah,
because we've caused the problems in the Ukraine,
I see.
and so this is a way to identify the Jesuit agents or Jesuit trained people. Over 10% of Congress members are Jesuit trained. And the CIA is also full of Jesuits. Ray McGovern, you may know, he's sort of an activist, former CIA person. I don't think there's anything called former CIA. I think you're part of that your whole life. But he's a Jesuit. The Homeland Security is basically the Jesuit Gestapo. It's Homeland Security and FEMA together. So this will all become part of the setup in the Ukraine to make the disaster that's happening there now. And what I want to recommend is two books. This is The Secret History of the Jesuits. And this is by Edmond Paris. He's a Frenchman who wrote the history of the Jesuits country by country in Europe. It's a fascinating book. It's very, very well written, and it's extremely informative and interesting. And what he said basically is that every country the Jesuits went into, they extracted all of the wealth as fast as they could. They destroyed the environment completely. They poisoned it. They ruined it. They looted the natural resources and left a mess. And then they genocided the people and left. Isn't that the pattern that we're seeing now, that the United States and Europe and NATO are following country by country? We don't see China doing that. We don't see other countries doing it to the extent that the the Anglo-American Permanent War Crimes Racketeering Syndicate has created this machine of death and exploitation. And you don't see many other countries doing that, although the U.S. now is co-opting other countries, smaller countries, third world countries, weaker countries, to join this unstoppable military. And what's so interesting is that it's through perversion of sex, it's through pedophilia and exploitation and destruction of children, it's through plundering and dirty financial banking practices. Wall Street and the City of London are two really good examples. And all these these belief systems and practices and laws and so forth that are counter to a civilized society. They're gangsters, and they love destroying things and killing lots of people. They're psychopaths. They have mental problems, and they join and become gangs like boys in the street, and they do horrific things together. And I think Kevin Annett has uncovered and exposed some of the most egregious actions I've ever heard of. And the agents of these actions, they are kings and they are queens, and they are CEOs of major corporations, and they are top admirals and generals and officers in the military. The Jesuits are doing this, and they are co-opting and destroying civilized nations and peoples, and it's all deliberate. They're trying to destroy and erase the history of all cultures and nations, so they can dominate the world with one religion, which is Catholicism, which is hardly a religion now. It's sort of an embarrassment. So what Putin has done, Putin has a very interesting background, and talking about being in their house. He was a colonel in the KGB, and he operated much of the Cold War in Germany. Angela Merkel was KGB during the Cold War, and she operated out of Berlin. So they know each other. They're old KGB friends, and they've known each other and trust each other for a very long time. And she may be doing things and saying things that she doesn't want to, that she doesn't believe are good for Germany. But this system has co-opted, blackmailed, and extorted cooperation from people who were normal before, from nations where it would have been unthinkable to participate in such egregious actions and practices. And it's not sustainable, as we're seeing now, because the Jesuits are through with the Western economy, which they created. They're collapsing it, and they are pumping China and Russia. But China and Russia have their own ideas, and Putin is certainly not going along with the Jesuits, and neither is China. They have now become strong partners, and what Putin has said directly and indirectly over and over again, he's building a moral society with ethics, with benefits to all. But in a country with such vast size and so many cultures and peoples and such a long history involved, it takes a strong leader. And people mistake him for a dictator. He's not a dictator. He's a czar, and he is restoring the beautiful. It was really an empire. He's restoring the good things in the old Russia, of the old Russia, without having a king on a throne, a czar on the throne in a palace. So I'm watching him very carefully, particularly with the Ukraine, because believe me, Alfred, and everyone who's listening, we are on the verge of being dragged into the dark ages where everything will be stripped from us. Our history of music, our history of art, our history of architecture, our history of knowledge, the libraries will be looted and stolen and hidden. That's what the Jesuits do. And all of our recorded history will disappear. Putin is the only one opposing strongly and enforcing his demands and his sense of fairness and so forth on the world stage. And the reason he's able to do it is because he has strengthened Russia. He has improved the living conditions and the economy of Russia. The salaries and the average family income in Russia in just the last year, 2013, increased 11% for the Russian people. That's a huge leap in their standard of living and their disposable income and so forth and so on. And I think that I did not understand what Chechnya was about, but I do now in understanding what his approach is and how he's executing his plans for the Ukraine, because Chechnya actually had a lot of troublemakers who had infiltrated it, and I believe they were sent there by the Jesuits, because NATO is Jesuit, the UN is Jesuit. World War I and World War II were engineered by the Jesuits to establish the UN. And these are very, very dangerous and very toxic organizations, and they are practicing widespread genocide and depopulation and theft of mineral resources and wealth from country after country.
Okay, now, just right before our little pause, what exactly is Putin's essential strategy in the Ukraine?
Putin is bound by the Russian Constitution as the head of Russia to protect Russian people. Whether they live in Russia or outside of Russia, it doesn't matter. He is bound by the Constitution and by his oath to protect Russians. And the eastern part of the Ukraine is Russian-speaking people. The Ukraine is a mixture of many kinds of people. So on the east side, they're Russian-speaking. They are Russian people. The Ukraine was part of Russia. It's historically been part of Russia. It was part of the Soviet Union. And it was Khrushchev, whose wife was a Cossack. Those are the people, the horsemen from Central Asia who moved across Asia, and some of them settled in the Ukraine. So he loved the Ukraine because he loved his wife, and they probably went on vacation there a lot. It was his favorite part of Russia to go to. And so he, in the 1950s, he gave the Ukraine sort of their freedom under the umbrella of the Soviet Union, and that included the Crimea. Now, he didn't anticipate the Soviet Union breaking up, and he did not anticipate that Crimea, which has always been part of Russia and is the only warm water port that Russia has, he never anticipated that the Ukraine would become an independent country separate from Russia, separate from the Soviet Union. But in the breakup in the early 1990s, that's what happened. And it has gone very poorly for the Ukraine since then. And what happened is the Ukrainians have always been more cultured. They have been very well-to-do, wealthy. They've had a higher per capita income than any other country in the region for a long time. They're the breadbasket of Russia and Europe, and they have industrial areas, and they also have very, very rich oil and gas deposits, which have not been developed except just initially. They provide about 30% of their own energy, so they haven't done very much in terms of developing the oil and gas deposits, and they are onshore and offshore. And so as you go from the very Russian part of the Ukraine on the east side across the Ukraine to the west side, which borders Moldova, Poland's on the north, you get more and more of a Slavic influence, fewer people speaking Russian or ethnically Russian, and more Ukrainian. It's a very different Slavic language from Russian, and the Ukrainian people have different origins. So that in the west part of the Ukraine, they're 95% Ukrainian and Ukrainian speaking. And in the center, the Transcarpathian area, you have Hungarians. It's a very complex country. It's called the steppes, the steppe, which is flat, vast land, and the flag of the Ukraine is yellow on the top, which, blue on the top, which represents the sky. It's big sky country. And on the bottom, you have yellow, which represents the ripening wheat that covers the Ukraine at the end of the summer and during harvest season. And the Ukraine is basically where many rivers from the Balkans and Europe come into a huge river floodplain. That is what the Ukraine is. It's the floodplain of the Black Sea, the northern side end of the Black Sea. And the soil is so rich, you can eat it with a spoon. It's a very wealthy country. Rimsky-Korsakov, the famous composer, was from the Ukraine. There are many other famous people, scientists and everything. And the Ukrainian people are very, very nice people. And what has happened since the end of the Soviet era is that oligarchs, who are basically criminals, have taken over the Ukraine, stolen the gold, the taxes, the IMF bank loans. They've looted that country since the Soviet era ended, and they have made a real mess out of the society, out of the economy, out of what was once a very well-functioning and rich country. The Ukrainians are very intelligent. There are many engineers and scientists, and they have wonderful agriculture there. They're creative people. And unfortunately, the United States, NATO, and the EU got involved in the Ukraine, and you can understand why Putin and the Russians would not want NATO and U.S. military bases right on their border, as NATO and the U.S. are planning to do with the EU, and that's to surround and contain Russia with these former satellite states of the Soviet Empire surrounding Russia. And we wouldn't want Russian military bases on the Canadian border in Canada and Mexico. And Putin has already gone and had a meeting a few months ago with Fidel Castro. He is modernizing and re-renting or reoccupying a former Soviet base in Cuba now. I don't blame him one bit. And so Putin, first of all, his priority has to be the Russian people. And he has 80% approval or 90% approval there. He's very, very popular. He goes on TV every week and he talks to people for hours. He takes their questions. He travels around. He's very involved and is aware and very involved in the government, the economy, everything. He handles the foreign relations, and his prime minister, Medvedev, handles the domestic relations. And he has very, very good people on his staff. They all work together. They're smart. I have so much hope for Russia and China, and really they're the hope for the world, because the Western economy is bankrupt. It's been looted. The Jesuits are done with it, and the new frontier, the new hope, the new economic engine for the world is in the middle space, which is China and Russia.
Right, right. So, how does all of this relate to the Jesuits?
Well, in May, suddenly an American U.S. Navy cruiser silently traveled through the Bosphorus, which is the waterway entry into the Black Sea from the Mediterranean, and Istanbul is right on the shore. And that ship, a U.S. cruiser, Aegis class, is the USS Donald Cook, and that was traveling through the Black Sea to the north towards the Ukraine. And I said, this is trouble. This is foreshadowing. This is American trouble. This is Jesuit trouble for the Ukraine in the northern Black Sea. And I want to find out who Donald Cook was. Why did they name a cruiser for him? Because that's very symbolic. I looked it up. Donald Cook was a young enlisted man who died in some kind of a military venture of the United States, and this cruiser was named for him. I knew he had to be a special person. So I started looking at his educational background, his family, his religion, everything. He was Catholic. He went to a Jesuit high school, and he was Jesuit trained. That's why that cruiser, named for him with the ties to the Jesuit, was sent as a symbol. Signs and symbols rule the world. To enter the Black Sea, to harass and to send a message of grandiosity by the United States, and that we would be back, the United States would be back in those territorial waters of Russia and the Ukraine. So what happened? What happened is the Orange Revolution was funded and executed by George Soros in the Ukraine and overthrew the government. This happened in many countries around former Soviet satellite states, oil-rich republics in Central Asia, Middle Eastern countries, Egypt. Then we had the Occupy movement in the United States and Canada. That was a Soros-colored revolution, but they called it Occupy instead. And these are all overthrows of legitimate governments, democratically elected governments by George Soros and the New World Order. They are working for the Jesuits. And so that cruiser, the USS Donald Cole, was the beginning of the U.S. Quietly invading the Ukraine and looting it. And Victoria Nuland in the U.S. State Department has been involved. George Soros is involved. The Rockefellers and the Council on Foreign Relations is involved. The U.S. State Department is involved. And President Obama and Congress are involved. Why are we involved in Ukraine's personal business? So this Orange Revolution was used to overthrow a legitimately elected government, and that happened last December. And in February, Victoria Nuland she selected and appointed a new government for the Ukraine without any elections. She just said, Yatsenyuk, you're going to be the prime minister. We will have an election for the president, but that won't be until May. And so there are photos of her standing there with the cabinet that she picked as a foreign country. And of course, she's representing the interests of oil companies and gas companies and all kinds of other predators, economic predators in the Ukraine. And on February 27, Yatsenyuk, who is an international banker, he's an oligarch too, he was sworn in as prime minister. They still didn't have a president. And he selected some of the people in the cabinet, or he installed them. And on the night of March the 6th, he was sworn in February 27th. On March the 5th, he looted 33 tons of gold, which was gold reserves that belonged to the government and the people of the Ukraine, in the middle of the night. And there were special forces from the U.S. military, or they were Blackwater private military. I don't know, nobody knows. But a plane was sitting on the runway. They never turned their engine off. These special trucks arrived wherever Yatsenyuk turned the gold over. And it was in 44 boxes of gold bullion, special boxes loaded into these special vehicles, zoomed to the airport. They loaded the gold on the plane, and the plane took off immediately in the middle of the night before even the air traffic controllers knew what was happening. And at the very last moment, a strange man in a long coat and hat, you couldn't see his face, appeared and got on the plane, and the gold was gone. It was flown to New York City and deposited in the basement of JP Morgan Chase in New York City, and the Ukraine will never see that gold bullion again. On the 7th of March, I have a photograph of Prime Minister Yatsenyuk, who just stole all the gold reserve of the Ukraine, in Obama's office in the White House with this big, hi, aren't we great handshake. And of course, Yatsenyuk had delivered the gold, and he left with a 10% bonus for transferring that gold illegally. He's illegal to the United States. And of course, it went into the Federal Reserve, which is owned by very, very wealthy people, the Rothschilds and the Jesuits and Queen Elizabeth and so forth. And the next thing that happened was Yatsenyuk and other people in the government had the president sworn in, Poroshenko, who was he is also an oligarch, and he is very dumb and easy to manipulate, and they call him the half-wit druggie in the news in the Ukraine now because of all the faux pas that he's made. But he has been handled by Victoria Nuland, and what happened when Poroshenko was sworn in was this movement, which actually started in May, by the Eastern Ukrainians, this pro-Russian group. It's a lot of people. It's like 8 million people. They wanted to secede from the Ukraine because they knew they would be genocided. And the Tymoshenko, who had been the prime minister, she's a woman who wears a blonde Russian braid on her head. She was the cheerleader of the Orange Revolution, and she looted huge amounts of money and had the money transferred into foreign banks. I think Putin will get that back, but he said he will. That's up in the air right now. But these oligarchs just transferred the foreign reserves. They looted all the money they could get their hands on and transferred it out of the Ukraine. So the Ukraine is broke now. And Poroshenko was ordered by the United States advisors and probably Victoria Nuland to destroy his own domestic army and National Guard. Now that's what happened here in the United States. It was George W. Bush and Clinton who destroyed our soldiers, and it started with George H.W. Bush by sending all our soldiers and National Guard to Iraq and Afghanistan, where they're completely poisoned and sick and dying and dead from the uranium and the nuclear weapons the U.S. used in those countries, those conflicts. So what we see is a template rolling out for the United States, for the Ukraine, for other countries. We've bombed something like 7 or 9 countries in 7 years. The United States is bombing countries all over the world. And it's just not a sustainable economic model for any country to follow. It doesn't create wealth. It's about looting and destroying the very entities that create wealth. And the idea behind the Silk Road was it was for commerce. It created tremendous wealth because countries traded, individuals traded, groups traded, guilds traded, and they did not waste their time and money and resources on wars. They traded peacefully for thousands of years in Asia and Southeast Asia. And even the Sumerians in what we call Iraq now, Baghdad and Basra, they traveled in boats in the Sumerian period. That was the beginning of city-states and kings and temples and cities. And they would sail all the way to India. They sailed all along, all over Southeast Asia, trading then. There's always been tremendous trade routes. And it was Magellan and Vasco da Gama, who began for the Portuguese and Spanish to look for trade routes to bring new wealth to their countries and to their kings and queens. But they went with gunships to Vietnam, to India, to the Philippines, to China, to Korea, to Japan, and at the with cannons pointed at your shoreline, these Europeans would go in and take over a country or take over resources, and they always looted, destroyed the environment, and genocided the people before they left. So Tun Dr. Mahathir, the former Prime Minister of Malaysia, said, oh, first we had the Portuguese gunships in the 1400s. It took us 200 years to get rid of them. Then the Dutch gunships arrived. That was the Dutch East India Company. The Portuguese ships and Spanish ships were the Jesuits. Then we had the Dutch East India Company. It took us 200 years to get rid of them. He said then the English East India Company came, and it took us 200 years to get rid of them. And Malaysia was only free from the as an English colony after World War II. And Mahathir said, I never allowed an American gunship, the U.S. Navy, to ever dock in any port in Malaysia. And that's the reason why it will take us 200 years to get rid of the American gunships. Well, they're coming into all the ports now. They've been taken over by the U.S., by the CIA and MI6. And Singapore is the Southeast Asian headquarters for MI6 and for the CIA to loot Southeast Asia. So going back to the Ukraine, and this happened in Chechnya, now I realize, also had these troublemakers and this asymmetric economy controlled by oligarchs who were stealing everything from the people, destroying the environment. And they might have been born in the Ukraine, but they're not ethnically Ukrainians. They might be from Lithuania or Russia or other countries, but ethnically they're not Ukrainians. They are interlopers. They're there to capitalize on difficulties or weaknesses in the country, a new country, and they've really exploited it. And what happened now is that Putin has been forced to protect Russia and to protect the Russian people in the eastern part of the Ukraine. And what is happening now is that Poroshenko, under orders and advisors, American advisors, military, State Department, all kinds, he was ordered to destroy his own army by engaging them in this conflict in eastern Ukraine. It would have been much more cost beneficial to give them their freedom. It's not a lot of land, but the oligarchs who had businesses and industry and mining interests there, of course, didn't want to let go of it. And so that they got their own private armies. The oligarchs have their own private armies. There are also extreme right nationalists from the western part of the Ukraine who are troublemaking, and they are Nazis. They have taken Nazi stencils from World War II that they probably had hanging in their living rooms, and they've painted Nazi symbols all over their tanks and armored personnel carriers. It's horrifying to see them rolling across the terrain and up and down the roads and the fields of the Ukraine with these Nazi symbols. And the Nazi symbol is something the Jesuits brought back from India, but as they reversed words and signs and symbols, they also reversed the original Indian symbol. I think it's of life and good things. It's a spiritual symbol. The Jesuits reversed it, and it was used by Hitler. He was a Catholic, but he based his whole Nazi empire on the Jesuit structure, hierarchical structure, and beliefs and actions and so forth, values. So that's why Hitler and the army in World War II were Nazis. It came from India through the Jesuits. And so these Nazis and these Western Ukrainians are actually mixed up. They're good people, but these bad people, the bad influences, are actually people from neighboring countries, Bulgaria, Romania, Moldova, Poland, who through the Crusades and through the Middle Ages, they got into trouble in some way, or they were rejected because they were mentally deficient, or they were criminals or whatever, and they ran away from their own countries and hid in Western Ukraine. These are who the Nazis are. These are who the troublemakers are, and they are siding with the oligarchs. They work together. Fascism and oligarchs go together. And they're working against the best interests of the people. So Putin has to clean them out. And just as he did in Chechnya. Now, what he did in Chechnya, he had to destroy the country to get rid of them. And then he put $1 trillion in Chechnya and rebuilt the entire country, the entire infrastructure. And it's clean and it's modern and it's beautiful, and those troublemakers are gone. So now Putin is doing the same thing with Ukraine, and maybe 10 or 15 years ago, the eastern part of Moldova wanted to secede from Moldova because they were being genocided and they're Russian speaking. And so he sent people in to advise, military advisors, to work with their secession movement, and they successfully separated into their own country called Transnistria. And I said, oh, I know what Putin's doing. He said, I don't want the Ukraine. He does not want that cauldron of troublemakers in the north and western part of the Ukraine. Plus, there's a lot of mental damage from the Chernobyl disaster. And so when I saw Transnistria and this eastern Novorossiya sliver on the east side of the Ukraine, I knew that he had to take the southern part of the Ukraine between Novorossiya and Transnistria and make one country out of that in order to protect Russia and to be able to protect the Russian-speaking people that he's mandated by the Constitution to do. And after all, that was part of Russia and it was part of the Soviet Union. So it's not so unreasonable. Now, with the Crimea, because Sevastopol was leased or rented from the Ukrainian government, it's always traditionally been a part of Russia and their warm water port. But the Ukrainian government was so crooked after the Soviet Union broke up, they allowed Russia to build a pipeline through the Ukraine from Siberia, from the oil and gas fields, into Europe. And with the help of Berlusconi, Putin secretly made 20-year contracts to supply all of the oil and gas to many of the European countries, or a large portion of it. And when the U.S. and the EU found out about these contracts, that's when HARP started hitting storms and ships sinking with sulfur on them that made sulfuric acid when they mixed with the Black Sea water, and oil tankers crashing and breaking up in these storms. They were HARP storms. I had a Turkish naval officer renting a room from me, and he woke me up in the middle of the night, came to my room and took me into his room, and he translated all of the Turkish news so that I would understand what was happening, and I knew right away it was HARP. And that was a payback from George W. Bush, Cheney, Rumsfeld, those guys, and British interests for Putin succeeding in making contracts first and building pipelines after he had the contracts. He said, we do it the opposite from America. They build the pipelines and then they start going and looking for contracts. And so that's why they punished Putin, because the U.S. has all these empty pipelines from Central Asia into the Mediterranean through Turkey, and no contracts to fill the pipelines. So, you know, the Russians are very strategic. They're very, very practical. They think long term, and Putin has cleaned the troublemakers, the betrayers, the oligarchs out of his cabinet, out of the government, he's been weeding it and improving the quality of people, the functioning of the government, and it's very obvious that Russia's on the way up with China. They're building a port together on the west side of the Pacific, on the Kamchatka Peninsula, I believe, and sharing it. And they know they're old friends. All the trading partners in Southeast Asia and Asia are old friends. They did not have wars against each other. So that is what is happening, and what we're seeing in the conflict now is a huge escalation between the militia, who represent the pro-Russian people living in that eastern part of the Ukraine, and all they had were a few old Kalashnikov guns. When this dispute started in May, they were not trained. Some of them had been in the military, but they weren't really trained military people. And they were up against the Ukrainian army and the Ukrainian National Guard. And Alfred, it has turned into a genocide of the Ukrainian military, more than a genocide of the Ukrainian citizens in that area, that region, although the long-term effects of the weapons they've been using, mini nukes and depleted uranium, is going to cause a lot of illnesses in the future, as well as the previous exposure from Chernobyl, which has also weakened the population. So what's happened now is the Eastern Ukrainian pro-Russian militia got more guns as they were successful in battles against the Ukrainian army, which is very poorly trained. They had very young conscripts with no military experience at all. The militia are in their own country land. They know all the geography. They know the guerrilla movement to push the army, the organized army, out of the eastern part of Russia. I'm sorry, the Ukraine. And as they won more and more battles, because of the ineptness of the Ukrainian army, they didn't even have food. Poroshenko, the president, was not sending them food. I saw pictures of Ukrainian soldiers catching snakes and cooking them over a campfire and eating them. That's all the food they had, what they could find locally, wild food. And they didn't have, a lot of them didn't have boots, they didn't have uniforms, and they were sent into war, even without guns, into the battlefield. And over time, the rebels kept surrounding them, and they would release them but keep all of the heavy equipment, the tanks, the armored personnel carriers, the huge rocket launchers, and these trucks that shoot grads. They're missiles that come out 40 at a time in maybe 5 minutes or 3 minutes. They're just horrendous weapons. And as they captured more and more of this large equipment, they became a better and better equipped militia. And because of low morale, poor training, poor conditions, living conditions, the Ukrainian army, they started defecting. 600 Ukrainian soldiers walked across the border into Russia and joined the Russian army. So they are being trained and sent back into eastern Russia to fight with the militia. And then battalions of the Ukrainian army refused to, or orders to go into war, to perform. This is happening more and more. And what's happened is now other parts of the Ukraine, the central part and the southern part where Odessa is, they are turning against their own government, and they are joining the militia and sending support. And people, men from all over the Mediterranean region, even from Brazil, have gone to the eastern part of Russia, eastern part of the Ukraine, to join the militia. So they have a brigade of Italians. They have a brigade of Turks. They even have an Afghan who came and volunteered. So they're getting more and more help, and the Ukrainian army now has almost no hardware. Poroshenko just went to Congress. Obama invited him to come and address Congress, and he went and begged for lethal weapons to use against the eastern Ukrainians. He meant nuclear weapons. He begged for big heavy equipment and heavier guns, and what they've done up until now from May is to shell all of the villages and the towns and destroy the whole infrastructure, blow up bridges, blow up a chemical factory, blow up the railroads. They've destroyed the whole infrastructure and forced 1 million people who are now homeless to go into Russia or other countries where they have relatives or friends. And of course, the winter is coming now. But the latest thing now is that Poroshenko asked for a ceasefire 3 times. There were 3 meetings in Minsk. Putin told them to go, the militia, and to participate. He knew exactly what was going to happen. And each time that there was a ceasefire, within 15 hours, the Ukrainian army was shooting at the militia and the civilians in the eastern part of Ukraine and destroying their lives, their homes, their towns, their agricultural fields, everything, blowing up the mines. And they've been, now that they've been pushed back in the last Minsk agreement a few weeks ago, both sides were told to take their heavy equipment and move back from a border line and to stop fighting. So they have, the Ukrainian army has continued to attack the militia and the civilians especially. But in the last couple of days, they have moved back. The OSCE, which is an international agency to observe war zones, they help both sides, but they also act as witnesses and make reports to international agencies. And they have been rescued a number of times. They were kidnapped by the Ukrainian army, and the militia have rescued them a number of times. So you can imagine what reports are going back to Europe about the real situation there. And in the last 2 days, as the Ukrainian army vacated these villages to go to the front lines to relocate, they have found graves with as many as 40 people. They are civilians who were tortured and killed. Militia from the pro-Russia side who were tortured and murdered, and they're doing prisoner exchanges now. A lot of the militia were shot in captivity, and the Ukrainian soldiers have been returned in good shape. And now some of the militia coming back and civilians have branding on their buttocks or on their bodies of the Nazi swastika. They made crude branding irons and burned them into the flesh of these captives.
Right. So the kind of thought or the insight that came to me looking at this from a over a couple of centuries is that if you look at it in terms of, say, the theme being Russia and the Jesuits, that here you have two historical figures. Number one, the Tsar on the one hand and Putin on the other. And it was the Tsar during the U.S. Civil War that really kept the U.S. together, where it was the Jesuits and the Rothschild interests that were attempting to deconstruct the U.S. at that point. If you fast forward it to 2014, it was really Putin who has been able, like the Tsar did back then during the U.S. Civil War in 1860s, 64, who has been able to deconstruct the Jesuit and Zionist, the Bloodline Bankers plan to use the Ukraine false flags as sort of the tinderbox or the linchpin for their World War III scenario, which would have been their depopulation and ecocide scenario. Does that make sense to you?
Yes, it does. It's actually a very, very good analysis. And this is a book called The Secret Terrorists, and it's by Bill Hughes. I recommend that people read this, including in Canada, especially Canada, because the United States and Canada are being destroyed by the Jesuits. Right now, Homeland Security and FEMA have been contracted to 15 other countries by Janet Napolitano, who was Jesuit trained at Santa Clara University in California. And Homeland Security is just the Nazi Gestapo from Germany. They're the enforcers, they're the punishers. And what's going to happen in the U.S. is it's going to be much, much worse than conditions under the Soviet Union, much more repressive. I was a staff scientist at the Lawrence Livermore Lab in 1989 to 91. And one day my lab partner came in and he said, "Oh, there's a KGB general here today." Two of them. And I said, "Oh, well, this is 1989 and we're still at war, Cold War with Russia, the Soviet Union. Why are they here?" And he said, "Oh, they're transferring the technologies of political control to the U.S. government." And I said, "What for?" And he said, "Oh, they're just going to flip the U.S. into the Soviet Union. They're going to turn it into the Soviet Union, and they're turning the Soviet Union into the U.S." Well, this is 20 years later, 25 years later, and that's exactly what they're doing.
Right.
And the technologies of political control are the electromagnetic frequencies, HARP, the mind control, neurolinguistics, all the garbage that we're seeing. It's starting to rear its ugly head now, and it's to artificially control the thoughts, the body functions, the minds, the society, everything about North America. And they're crashing this vast region and stripping it of all of its wealth. That's the accumulated wealth of the labor of American people since 1776, even before that. And that's what they do. They destroy the environment, they loot all of the wealth, and then they genocide the people. And I live in San Francisco Bay Area in Berkeley. For 3 days, it's been misting outside, not raining, misting. There are heavy chemtrails, and there are elevated levels of radiation now coming from Fukushima that are all over the U.S. It's high all over the U.S. and along the Canadian border. It's probably high in Canada too. And what that means is that they are, at the time that the season is changing, you get in the spring and the fall, you get cold nights and hot days. And that heat difference, those temperature changes, stress the bodies of living things and cause diseases and illnesses to enter, and when normally the immune system could prevent these diseases. And then they're adding chemicals in the sky, radiation from Fukushima coming down in the rain. The rainwater is contaminated, the environment is contaminated, the Pacific Ocean is ruined. We cannot eat anything out of the Pacific Ocean anymore. And they're poisoning the groundwater, the very old groundwater in the aquifers, the deep water, which is 1,000,000 years old or even more. It's very pristine and pure. And by fracking illegally, but Halliburton is doing the fracking with these horrible poisons. And the EPA and the U.S. government has given them an exemption. They're doing this all over the world, poisoning whole countries, whole societies, destroying governments this way. And after they soften up the civilian population, they're putting poison in drinking water here in the U.S., especially in black communities. They are introducing ozone into black communities at night secretly. It's a horrific agent of disease and death. And I can't even eat pork or chicken. It is so full of chemicals. I bought a duck. And if you boil these meats now in the U.S., there's an inch of this brown bubbly scum on the top of the pot. So they are doing something to the meat or to the fat in the meat, which is necessary for humans to have a balanced diet. They have to have animal fat. And so all of these insults are combining synergistically, multiplying each other, and increasing the death rates and shortening the lifespan of people. And I can assure you the global population is probably half of what it was 20 years ago. I have UN reports that indicate that, and then I have UN charts and propaganda pieces they put out into the media, and they circulate through the internet that show we're overpopulated by 9 billion people, or it's going to be 8 billion, by Christmas, blah, blah, blah. That's all a cover-up for the very severe depopulation that started with the nuclear bomb tests.
Well, let's go because we're about an hour and 45 minutes into this segment now. So I'd like to get more into how ingrained the Jesuits are into the U.S. political system, into the Judenjuda, into their control of the oil companies, of companies like Cargill, which are also satanic companies, into mining and science. Could we begin to run through that?
Yes. During and after the Civil War, the Jesuits, of course, came with especially the French into North America. And so Washington, D.C., Halifax, Canada, Mobile, Alabama, Ottawa, Toronto, California, because it was settled by the Spanish. Um, all of French Canada is full of Jesuits, and Baltimore, Maryland are big, big, big Jesuit centers. And they have always been very big on education. They started universities and colleges and high schools all over every country they've been in because if you remember what Cardinal Richelieu said, give me a child to the age of 7 and he's mine forever. And so they have a mask or a costume. They have a disguise of Catholicism, but they're not Catholics. They're a military organization. As we discussed in the last interview, I had Napoleon's quote about them. He said they're not a religion at all. They're a military organization. So out of these centers, they have developed science. They have developed GMO, genetically modified organisms, came out of the Jesuits. They have always been scientists very interested in waves and waveforms. So HARP is one of their creations. The wireless, digital, all of these new technologies, nanotechnology, which is extremely poisonous to living organisms, and nanoparticles do not occur in nature in large amounts. So they've developed all these technologies, and they've done it by infiltrating the U.S. government. Over 10% of the U.S. government, of Congress, are Jesuits. Obama was Jesuit trained at Claremont University before he went off to Columbia University, where Brzezinski of the Council on Foreign Relations and the Trilateral Commission, he's a crazy Polish psychotic working for David Rockefeller. He was Obama's mentor and handler. Nancy Pelosi, her husband, Jesuits. Her family came out of Baltimore. Her father was Argentinian. He became a labor boss when he immigrated to Baltimore. He operated out of there. Oh gosh, so many members of Congress. It's amazing. It's more than 10% too. And people in the federal government. Now, there are also people like Benjamin Fulford, who is in Japan. He operates out of Tokyo. And
sorry, could I come in here?
Yes.
Obama went to Occidental College, then Columbia.
That's part of the Claremont complex.
Oh, is it?
Yes.
Okay.
He went to a special institute, I think, for economics. It's all Jesuit influence. That whole center.
Right. Of course, he was there. There's the argument that he never went to Columbia or to Harvard Law. And there's nobody that can remember him there because he was a covert CIA agent at the time.
Well, he's a Jesuit puppet, is what he is.
Right. Oh, okay, good. I just wanted to get that straight.
Wherever he was, that's where he was. He was with the Jesuits.
Right.
So he has done many things and has many practices and beliefs, and there are many indicators. Once you start learning about the Jesuits, he's a genocider. He's a killer. He's doing things, signing bills, executive orders that are killing Americans. He's not a friend of humanity. He has Jesuit beliefs and values, and he's handled by them. Other people, I'm talking about activists, for instance, or the progressive left media on the internet and in radios. George Nouri from Clear Channel Coast to Coast is Lebanese American. He's Jesuit trained. Madonna is Jesuit trained, and she's talking all the time about the Kabbalah. Well, the Kabbalah, the Babylonian Talmud, and then the other cultic beliefs and practices of the Babylonians, magic and things like that, those have all been passed up through the Egyptian Empire, through the Roman Empire, through Venice, the Venice Empire, or the Empire of Venice, through the Roman Catholics. And so I looked at this list of the all of the Jesuit superior generals since Ignacio Loyola in the 1500s, and every one of them was born and from a country that was part of the Habsburg Empire, the Holy Roman Empire. So the Jesuits were funded and founded by Francis Borgia. So now we're going back to who's over them. It's the families in the Roman Empire and the empires before that. They're probably all intermarried. They're bloodlines that are thousands of years old. And that's who's really controlling the Jesuits. But you never see that hidden hand. You just know the name from the medieval period or whatever. But they're still around. The Plantagenets, for instance, came from William the Conqueror, the Duke of Normandy, who conquered England in 1066. Well, the Plantagenets were Catholics. They're Jesuits too. They stopped using that name, the Plantagenet, as a last name. It's actually what the Da Vinci Code symbolizes. It's about, the Da Vinci Code is about the Plantagenets, but they stopped using the Plantagenet name in England as their last name in 1900. And something like 65 or 85 members of the House of Lords in England, they run England still. The Plantagenets are still running England, ruling England. And Queen Elizabeth has Plantagenet blood. But they are running the House of Lords. They're running England. They're tremendously wealthy landowners, but they're hidden. They don't, those are the kinds of people who are running this planet now.
Right.
Other people are, Alex Jones is Jesuit trained. He works for MI6, British intelligence. Jeff Rentz is probably, he's probably Jesuit trained as well. So a lot of people that I haven't understood why they reacted very hostilely to me in the work that I've been doing to stop the poisoning of the world with nuclear technologies, where those are their technologies because they were at the Oak Ridge National Lab when it was the Clinton Lab in the 1950s. And the scientists developing or doing the research to develop and commercialize nuclear power was an Austrian who was a product of the Vienna School, and he was sent to the U.S. He was a Manhattan Project scientist in World War II. He was sent to the U.S. in the 30s. And when World War II was over, he was sent into the Clinton laboratory managed by Monsanto, which was funded by Miss Monsanto, who was a Sephardic Jew from Spain, married to an Irishman, a Catholic. And she gave him the money to start Monsanto. Well, Monsanto is another organization, corporation poisoning the world. And so you see this partnership everywhere, if you look for it, between Catholics and Jesuits, Irish Catholics and Jesuits, Spanish and Italian Catholics and Jesuits. They're inseparable. And the once I found out that the Habsburg Empire was where most of them, they all came from, then I started looking at our politicians. Okay, John Kerry is involved in Ukraine right now. He's the Secretary of State. He was also involved in Afghanistan and very involved in it as a senator. Well, it turns out that John Kerry's real name is Cohen, and his family were Houdan Judah, or house Jews like the Rothschilds, to the Habsburg emperors. They advised them, and they became wealthy, and they are multi-generational advisors. His family escaped from Czechoslovakia in World War II. Historic art treasures and cultural treasures in Europe are not allowed to be removed from the continent. His family bought a chateau in Normandy near where the Normandy beach invasion happened in World War II, and they put all their art treasures in that chateau, and they escaped to the United States, where they converted to Catholicism and masqueraded as Irish Catholics. His father married the daughter of the Forbes family, not the Forbes magazine family, but the Forbes old English opium smugglers family. And so his fortune is made from the Habsburg Empire and from his mother's family, who were Boston Brahmins. Boston Brahmins means they were opium smugglers and had fast clipper ships and were in partnership with the British.
And he's Skull and Bones.
And Skull and Bones. And the Jesuits went to China in the 1500s. They started the opium trade in China. They addicted 250 million Chinese by 1900. Can you imagine how much money that is? And they're the ones running Dope Incorporated. The British are the mask on it, but it's the Jesuits running the dope trade.
Right.
Carey recently, 12 years ago, I guess, he married Teresa Heinz Carey. He was divorced, and she was the widow of the Heinz tomato ketchup heir, who was a senator in the U.S. Congress. He was killed in a plane crash. She inherited $200 million when he died, and she and Carey ended up getting married. Now, they're both Catholics, practicing Catholics, but I found a description of their wedding ceremony, and he was married wearing a yarmulke and under the canopy that is used in Jewish weddings. So they are both crypto Jews. They are both Jesuit trained as well. And so when Madeleine Albright is another crypto Jew who is Jesuit trained. I mean, the whole government is full of them. The State Department is full of them. They're running this country. The Jesuits own outright the, what's the name of the agricultural company?
Cargill.
Cargill. And that's a horrific center of pedophilia throughout the corporate world. So when you start looking, every rock you turn over, there's a Jesuit under it.
Right, right. So could you bring us full circle then to the Argentinian Jesuit Pope?
Yes. Now this is really interesting. But how do you pronounce his last name? Bergoglio.
Bergoglio.
Oh, Bergoglio, yes. He became a pope when Ratzinger was forced to resign because of his involvement in pedophile rings and murdering children in Ninth Circuit these ceremonies, twisted ceremonies they have. And he is now Pope Francis. He was also involved in disappearing people in Argentina during the junta. He has also been named in court testimony in Belgium at the International Criminal Tribunal that Kevin Annett organized about pedophilia in the Catholic Church and in the Queen Elizabeth as well. And Bergoglio is the first Jesuit pope. Now, what's interesting about Bergoglio is Argentina is due to have a very large slice of the mineral pie of Antarctica. The British attacked and took the Falkland Islands, which really belonged to Argentina, but they stole them so that they could get access or a share of the mineral pie in Antarctica. A country must have a geologic connection structurally to the Arctic or the Antarctic in order to share in the mineral pie. The British are now annexing the South Island of New Zealand. They're removing it from the country of New Zealand, and it's their headquarters, Queen Elizabeth and so forth, at headquarters in the Southern Hemisphere to have access to the mining of Antarctica. And that is why Pope Francis was chosen as the new pope to replace Ratzinger. It's his ties to Argentina and that mineral pie of Antarctica, because it's the Jesuits who are going to benefit more than any other country. Norway, because of the Norwegian explorers in the early part of the 20th century, Norway has the largest claim in Antarctica. So what's happening globally now has a lot to do with dividing up the Arctic and Antarctic mineral deposits and riches, and they're very, very rich. And now they have all these Jesuit technologies, HARP and the mind control and that sort of stuff. The Jesuits are really planning to take over the whole world. From what I'm seeing Homeland Security do here in the Bay Area, it's horrifying. They came in and did an inventory of all the food sources, cafes, coffee houses, restaurants, food stores, warehouses, Costco, everything. And a lot of food items are disappearing now. The quality of the food is going down. Even the wrappings, the plastic bags that you put fresh produce in, fall apart when you pull them off the roll in the store. Everything, services, everything is going downhill. And it's because North America, Europe, and Japan are being collapsed. Now, Pope Francis has ties to something else that is very important. It is palladium. Palladium is one of the metals in the platinum, palladium, gold, and rhodium family. They are very valuable because they're inert. They can be used for jewelry and this and that, and they're quite rare. They're fairly rare. And what I discovered was palladium prices started going up like crazy when they had been very flat. Platinum gold were always preferred over palladium and rhodium. And in the early 90s and late 80s, early 90s, I noticed palladium prices were going up and staying up. And there was really not a very good explanation in the public media for what was causing this increase. Well, I did find out that palladium and platinum are used in those, what are they called? They put them on cars to make the fuel. Catalytic converters, right. And I found out that they're used in catalytic converters, but I also found out inadvertently on my trip to Canada when I don't, yes, I came to the conference in British Columbia, the 9/11 conference, because of you. And I found out from two old geezers who were extracting palladium and platinum from an old smelter. They went through the tailings pile, and they had a very high temperature furnace to do it. And they were selling this palladium to Los Alamos National Lab. Well, they don't make jewelry, Alfred. They make nuclear weapons. And then I began investigating the mini nukes used at the World Trade Center in Iraq, in Lebanon, in Gaza, and I started realizing that the palladium is used in the construction of these mini nukes. They're 5 kilotons or under, and they're exempt from all international nuclear weapons treaties. And guess who has the biggest supply, really the world's supply of palladium? Guess what country has more palladium than anybody else and sets the prices because of that?
Argentina?
Russia.
Oh, Russia.
Putin controls the palladium.
I see.
Globally, other countries have some, but not very much. And I just think that is so funny. And I know that Poroshenko went to Obama to ask him for these mini nukes to use against the Eastern Ukrainians. And Obama said, no, I don't believe that he did not. I think he gave the Ukraine, or sent people over to administer the use of them, oversee the use of them. But these fourth generation nukes that use palladium, and they have a substructure, a physical structure like thermite. That's why Stephen Jones is calling them super thermite. Well, Webster Tarpley, David Ray Griffin, and Stephen Jones are all Jesuits, Jesuit trained. Stephen Jones is a Mormon, but that's the same thing as being a Jesuit. And so I discovered that Sam Cohen, who had invented the neutron bomb, and it was never officially tested, he was awarded the highest Vatican Peace Medal that exists by, I forgot which pope it was. He was awarded the highest Vatican medal for developing the neutron bomb. So do the Jesuits have it? Are they interested in it? Of course they are. They were probably behind the development of it.
Right.
So there is Putin sitting there with his discernment. He can decide who gets to buy palladium from Russia and who doesn't. Go ahead.
Right. Good.
Good.
Now, I have two questions because we're coming to the end of this segment, and the first is, if we look at the two major false flags that brought the United States and the world to its present condition, those two false flags involve many of the same parties.
Yes.
They were the assassination of John Kennedy on November 23rd, 1963, and the 9/11 false flag on September 11th, 2001. Could you describe what you see as the Jesuits' involvement in each of those?
Well, those were executed on their orders. Many men and women in the military are Jesuit trained, especially at the highest levels. The presidents, many of the presidents are Jesuit trained. I'm sure the Jesuits control Skull and Bones. They control much of the university life. They control science. They set up the Royal Society of London in the 1600s. So these false flags.
Yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
These false flags are being carried out by the Jesuits and for the Jesuits to bring about transformations that they want to happen that benefit them, and take our rights, take our wealth, take our lives, take our fertility. I mean, they're destroying humanity is what they're doing with perverted science and perverted sociology. The MITRE Corporation pays the Jason scientists. They're the successors to the Manhattan Project scientists in World War II. And the Jason scientists are the scientists who work for, civilian scientists who work for and advise the Pentagon. MITRE Corporation was started by scientists at MIT, Massachusetts Institute of Technology in Boston. That's a huge, very big Jesuit center. Boston College is there. Carrie went to Boston College. That's where he was trained as a Jesuit. The drug trade went in and out of Boston. Those are the Boston Brahmins, and the Jesuits were there. How could it not be a Jesuit false flag, since all the wars and the organizations that are enslaving us are all Jesuit creations? The MITRE Corporation paid the Jesuit scientists, basically the Jason scientists, to create HAARP. And remember, the Jasons were all involved they're very interested in waves, energy. And the Bushes were very involved in carrying, it's the politicians and the intelligence services who carried out 9/11. And that's all, they're all Jesuit linked. They're all Jesuit trained.
Right, right. Now, our final question is this, and it really goes back to the end game, and it goes to Bergoglio, who's already making moves this way, and that's the famous quote: "One world religion, one world government, and the sole source economy."
Right.
Could you give us your perspective on, is that what Bergoglio is moving toward, and is he orchestrating on behalf of these larger forces?
Absolutely. But what I wanted to do is just finish the answer to the last one.
Sorry. I thought you had.
I thought I had too, but then I remembered JFK.
Oh.
What are the links to JFK's assassination and the Jesuits? The links are that Colonel Lansdale, who was in World War II most of the time in Japan and worked for General MacArthur, he was Jesuit trained. There were other officers at that time in key positions who were Jesuit trained, but the plan that came, the template for the assassination of Kennedy, came out of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. And it was General Lemnitzer, who was the Chief of Staff of the United States military when Kennedy took office, who planned the assassination and executed it with other members of the Joint Chiefs. Of course, there were oil men, and LBJ was involved. LBJ was also Jesuit trained. He was actually a Mexican Jew, Sephardic Jew from the conquistador period. So are the Castros in Cuba, conquistadors. And those are the Sephardic Jews who were associated and started the Jesuits. And the Jesuits sent them to the New World. So Kennedy was assassinated. Lemnitzer had a big chip on his shoulder. He hated Kennedy because in the first meeting that Kennedy had with the Joint Chiefs, he took an aide with him, went into the office of the Joint Chiefs and sat down. And after 15 minutes, these are the guys who cooked up Operation Northwoods, which was that was basically the blueprint for 9/11 and for these MH370 and MH17 crashes, Malaysian Airlines false flags, and many others. So they were sitting there cooking up these wild ideas for crashing planes into buildings to start a false flag and blame another country like Cuba or whoever they wanted, to have looking down an American gun barrel. And so Kennedy was sitting there, and he turned to his aide after 15 minutes. He said, "Let's get out of here." He got up and walked out of this meeting. And he's walking down the hall, and he turned to his aide and he said, "Those effing people are absolutely crazy." And he would never meet with them. And so it was them who assassinated Kennedy. And Lansdale, all through the war, was running the sniper teams and the assassination teams. He would go to the Philippines and get sharpshooters and bring these Filipino sharpshooters back to Japan. And they assassinated all of the people who wanted a democratic movement and a democratically elected government when World War II was over. He shot all the student leaders. He shot all the railroad union leaders. He just executed anyone he wanted to. And if you think this sounds exaggerated, it's Colonel Lester Prudy who revealed this in an interview that's on the website. So that is exactly what happened. And it's very, very sad because that group, Lemnitzer and the Joint Chiefs and other people in the government, the CIA and Skull and Bones and everything, they killed the dream makers in America. They assassinated Kennedy. They assassinated Martin Luther King. They assassinated Malcolm X and a lot of other people who were the dream makers for America. And look what we got. We got the Nazis, Jesuit-controlled or Jesuit-trained from the Habsburg Empire regions, mostly Germany. A lot of German crypto-Jews, the Bushes, all kinds of them, Cheney, probably Rumsfeld. And all they did was set up the Third Reich in America. And look what Homeland Security is. It's the the Jesuit Gestapo that will implement this Jesuit plan, which is reflects the Nazi period in Germany, a very dark period of history. And if you read the activists and the media coverage, alternative media coverage on the Ukraine, you can pick out, even in the militia sites, the writers who are products of that Bolshevik thoughts and the communism values, and they're very militant and very right-wing, and they are working with the oligarchs to set up a Third Reich in the Ukraine. But Putin is not going to allow that to happen. So let's go back to the last question, and that is Pope Francis. Pope Francis is setting up a Nazi architecture, Nazi Jesuit model template for the world, and it's called a total monopoly on everything and total control of all living things. Single source for everything. I see that happening already in the Bay Area, single sourcing. And so there will be only one source for all nails. There will be only one source for all milk. There will be only one source for all food items. There will be only one source for cars, so on and so forth. It's just the worst extreme form of communism that you can imagine. We will not be allowed to move around. They are using terrorism already in the streets, in the shops, on the sidewalks of the Bay Area. It's very frightening, and they're doing it, and Putin is the only one opposing it. And it's because the Jesuits were never allowed in Russia.
Right.
The Bolsheviks were from Brooklyn. They were funded by Jacob Schiff and the Rothschilds. The Schiffs and Rothschilds intermarried from the time they shared a house, Amstel Meyer Rothschild, who was the first one, and their children intermarried. So Al Gore is very high in that hierarchy because his daughter married one of the Schiffs.
Right, right. And what I'd like to do also is just just mention this, because this also is something that you've brought out in your research, and it dovetails so much with this groundbreaking series that you have done on the Jesuits. And that is that today our channel, Exopolitics TV, has also released an interview with a Spanish journalist, Rafa Pal, that has gone back to Babylon as well. And what he's discovered is that, like Jesuitism and like the Jesuits, Judaism is actually a Babylonian-based religion that started in the temples of Babylon and just rebranded itself as Judaism.
Right.
And is a satanic religion, and just rebranded the satanic Luciferic Babylonian gods into Yahweh, who's essentially Luciferic. So here we have, and this is kind of a convergence which happened synchronistically today. There was no planning of it. Today's Friday, September 26, 2014. Some say that under the Atlantean system, September 26 is the Atlantean New Year. Be that as it may, but you showed that the Jesuits are really the morphed and rebranded Babylonian cult
of the inner temple.
Yeah, of the inner temple. And we also have Rafa Pal showing that Judaism, the Judaic religion, is a morphed Babylonian religion, where the first coin was made, called the shekel, which was actually made by the priests there so that they could exchange the farmer's grain for the sex with the temple prostitutes for the grain. And that's where prostitution was born. So that's where banking and the temple was born, and that was brought over to the Jewish temples, where you had you have both an administrator and a rabbi, and where the Jewish temples were actually both the banks and then the divine temples. That was Jesus. Jesus objected to do that. So, yeah. So
it's also,
I
go ahead.
yeah. So I just wanted to show the diabolical origins of both Jesuitism and Judaism, and that they're both secret, and that throughout these. Oh, sorry. There's a piece of paper that went in front.
Okay.
We're I know we're uncovering something, and
Yeah.
and so here we have uncovered all of the false flags. And some people say, "Oh, it was Israel. Oh, it's the Jesuits." Well, it's Babylonia. It's Babylon and the Jesuits and Israel and all of these forces that essentially are diabolical, and duality consciousness, and the negative ETs, the demon world, whatever you want to call all those dimensions. But I just want to point out those profound revelations and convergences that I find, really the hope. That's a very hopeful sign that we've been able to root out and expose that profound corruption.
And the most important thing, perhaps, that confuses people and why they're so successful at hiding themselves is that they create layers of separation. And this whole phenomenon creates its own victims for cover.
Right. Right.
Inner temple, outer temple. So
Right.
there's a secret group or core with all this stuff plastered on the outside, and so everybody's looking at the trees,
Yeah.
and nobody's looking at the sky.
Yeah. Exactly. Well,
And that's why they're still operating. That's how they hide themselves, and that's how they get away with this. It's all in secret.
right. It's all in secret. Well, so we've begun to expose some of the inner secrets here of the inner temple. That having been said, are there any sort of thoughts that you'd like to leave our viewers with at the conclusion of this two-part series on the Jesuits?
Well, I want to explain that we're talking about dark energy and people, dark forces. And that's really what the Babylonians and everyone since then has been talking about. People have character defects. Some people are weak. People are selfish. It's because they're afraid they won't be able to compete for what they need. There are lots of reasons. Some people have mental deficiencies. Some people have bad parenting. There are all kinds of reasons that these insecurities develop in people. But it's lust, jealousy, envy, and gluttony that drive this dark energy. It's insecurities in people. And so we need to understand that in order to reverse that, or to handle it, or to cure that source of extreme malice in the world, we must embrace it. And by keeping it close to us and understanding how it manifests itself, that's how ancient societies have protected themselves, along with the amulets and beads and crosses and animal protectors. I mean, before there was writing or anything, indigenous people were dealing with that dark energy. And the way we have to do it and the way we have to deal with it, and I've learned very much from watching Putin, is to always be in a state of right conduct. We don't have control over anybody else or what they do. We only have control over ourselves. And so we must conduct our lives. It's so important now because of the danger field we're going through to always perform your life, to carry out your life with right conduct. And we must protect our families, our friends, our communities, just as Putin is doing for the Russian people. But in fact, he's helping all the people around the world to deal with this overwhelming dark force that's taking over the world. Eventually, it loses its energy. It overextends itself. It overreaches. It does too much evil, or it's too destructive, or whatever. That's where we are now. And the Ukraine is the turning point for everyone on this planet. And we must inform ourselves, educate yourself about Putin and about the Russian culture and about what he's trying to do. Each country, each culture, each family will find their own way. But if each person begins trotting in the right direction, no matter what, they will come out in the light eventually.
Well, thank you very much. And we want to thank you, Leuren, for the profound effort and research and time and energy that you took in putting together this two-part series exposing the Jesuits, which certainly is a service to humanity and a service to our planet. And we look forward to your returning again to our viewers in the future.
I am a mother, I am a woman, and I am a scientist. And that is what I have to give to humanity, to educate humanity, to empower humanity. And I get just as much back, maybe more. So focus your life on giving instead of getting.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.